John Inazu, and I'm a faculty member of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and also a member of the law school here. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for tonight in the second of 3 events in our ongoing spring discussion series, Religion in an Age of Fracture. Our final event will be a discussion between Emma Green and me. Emma Green writes for The Atlantic. That will be right here on April 3rd. Tonight's discussion features my co-teacher, Eboo Patel, and Ken Stern. Eboo is a leading voice in the movement for interfaith cooperation and the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps. He's the author of Acts of Faith in 2010, Sacred Ground in 2013, and Interfaith Leadership in 2016. Eboo is a regular contributor to the public conversation around religion in America and a frequent speaker on the topic of religious pluralism. For over 15 years, he has worked with governments, social sector organizations, and colleges and university campuses to help realize a future where religion is a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. He holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. Ken Stern is co-founder and president of Palisades Media Ventures and the former CEO of National Public Radio. He is the author of Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right, published last year, and also the book With Charities for All, Why Charities Are Failing and a Better Way to Give, published in 2013. Ken is a frequent contributor to publications including The Atlantic, Slate, The Daily Beast, and The Washington Post. Prior to joining NPR, he was a senior executive in American International Broadcasting. Earlier in his career, he held positions in Democratic politics. Ken holds degrees from Haverford College and Yale Law School. Please join me in welcoming Eboo Patel and Ken Stern.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to, we've had a great afternoon.
Yes.
Great dinner. I brought all of my counterintuitive ideas to Ken after the book that he wrote. I figured you're the person I could bring them to. So I appreciated the opportunity to do that with you over the seminar today and over dinner. I must say that I'm jealous of you because not only did you have a great idea for writing this book, not only do you have a very lyrical writing style, but neither your spouse nor your editor stopped you from free-flowing with cuss words throughout the manuscript.
So could I say that as many bad words as I put in my book are nothing against the way my wife talks at home. So maybe she has to give me a pass on it.
But I thought it was a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. And what strikes me is you bring 2 themes throughout the whole book, right? One is the dangers of tribalism for a diverse democracy, how polarized we really are, and how deeply damaging that is to attempting to build a healthy, diverse democracy. And the second is just how partial so many of us are in our approach to issues. There's a great line you quoted towards the end of the book that the greatest bias isn't liberal bias or conservative bias, it's confirmation bias. And we basically find ourselves absorbing the facts that we want to see. So what I'd like to do in the course of our 30 minutes or so in this format before we go to the audience is bring these themes through the set of questions I'm going to ask you. And the first question is there a story that precipitated your interest in writing this book, something that personally happened to you or something that you read, you thought to yourself, I have a great idea for a book?
So I've been thinking about this, the idea of trying to understand our politics by seeing it from the other side for a while. And it comes out of sort of concern for how polarized, how angry we are. And the fact that shouting at the other side doesn't seem to work as a part of constructive democracy. But the idea really crystallized around something called the Hobart Street Pledge. So I live in this nice neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Mount Pleasant. Some of you may know it. It's a lovely neighborhood. I've lived there for 20 years. It's very, as I write in the book, it's very diverse when it comes to sort of black, brown, and white, and to the rainbow colors of the colors of the rainbow flag, but not so diverse when it comes to political persuasion. It's 94% Democratic. My house is 100% Democratic. Judith Stein outpolled Donald Trump in my district, my precinct, 74-70 in 2016. There aren't a lot of districts that Donald Trump came in third. And that was always sort of something you might notice about the area, but it's really not all that different from the rest of the city and a lot of areas in the country. Until, and I didn't take much note of it until the Hobart Street Pledge. So we have a lot of team spirit on Hobart Street. That's my home street. We close the street for Halloween, and we close it for something called Porch Fest, which is our summer festival. And it's a townhouse, a row house community. We all do things on our porches. It's great fun for the kids, a lot of kids. And there's always a big parade with a fire truck, and all the kids lead the parade. It's really nice. It all begins with something called the Hobart Street Pledge. And I always liked the idea of the pledge, sort of the sense of community in this atomistic world. And they've changed the pledge every year a little bit, whoever is writing it. And one year it went something like this, I'm paraphrasing, but it went, all are welcome on Hobart Street, man or woman, gay or straight, white or black, everybody but Republicans. And it was a joke, but it wasn't a joke, right? I mean, because we've now gotten to a place where there's a social compact, which is framed, but we're not allowed to dislike someone for a different religion or different race. But it is okay to dislike someone for a different politics. It's a very dangerous place. So that was sort of the starting gun. I wrote actually a mediocre article for The Atlantic about the Hobart Street Pledge, which made me somewhat unpopular on Hobart Street. But that really began sort of my desire, like, wait a minute. How could it be that we don't want Republicans as neighbors? Maybe I need to see things through their eyes, and that's the story of the book.
Yeah, it's the introduction of the book. It's a wonderful introduction. Part of what you do in this book is you tell stories so well. You tell journalistic stories really well. You tell personal stories really well, and you have this gift of being able to juice complex social science studies into like 3 highly readable paragraphs. Add that to the fourth reason I'm jealous of you.
Yeah, well, that's because I can't actually understand more than 3 paragraphs myself, so it sort of helps.
I'm wondering if, and I was struck by the range of social science studies out there on the extent of our polarization, how parts of it are woven into our neuroscience and psychology. I'm wondering if you can just tell one or two if you can juice 1 or 2 of these studies into a handful of sentences that really, studies that illustrate for you how deep and dangerous our polarization is.
Yeah, so I will tell, I mean, there are so many interesting ones. It's hard to give it justice to. So one is, I'll start with, actually not a study, but a poll that the Washington Post did during the course of the election. Because I think it begins to show how divided we are. They did a poll in Virginia, a purple state, asking people whether they knew, they asked Clinton supporters whether they had any close personal friends or family members voting for Trump, and they asked the same question of Trump supporters, whether they knew anyone supporting Clinton. And so it's an interesting question, and sort of intuitively you would think, most everyone must know someone for the other side. They must be related to them. They must have close personal friends, especially in a state like Virginia, which is evenly divided. But it turns out, and I had to sort of recognize the question for myself, we actually sort ourselves out much more than we used to. It's called the big sort. We sort ourselves out, so we actually create communities where you only know people from your side. And more than 50% of Clinton voters and 50% of Trump voters didn't know anyone who was voting for the other side. And when you, and I mention that because I think that's sort of an extraordinary thing. And I was sort of shocked until I realized it was true for myself. But when you only know people on your side, it becomes very easy to demonize the other side. And you can see that in a lot of different social science studies. And the one I think that I'll mention here is, I think, the foundational study in the area, which is really about sort of how team and identity becomes so strong in us so quickly. And that's the work of a fellow by the name of Henri Teufel, who was a Polish social scientist who actually has sort of a really compelling story. He was a Polish Jew who couldn't study in Poland because of his religion, so his family sent him to France, I believe. And because of that, he missed, unlike the rest of his family, he missed the Warsaw Ghetto and the horrors of that. So Teufel's studies after World War II was really around, how could it be, I mean, like a lot of social science, he was trying to understand, how could it be that so many people, how could the Holocaust have happened? How could Nazism have happened? How could we have, the Germans and others so readily signed up for such a horrible thing? And he did a series of studies in the 60s and then the 70s, which showed sort of the pull of team identity. And you hear me, and they're kind of funny, but you think through the implications of them, they're quite scary. So one thing he did was actually with English schoolboys, is he did a series of studies where he divided them up into teams on the most arbitrary of basis. One thing he did, showed them a picture of, he saw all these kids, pictures of dots on a page, and said, guess how many dots there are on this page. And then he divided the teams up into overestimators and underestimators. And then he didn't even introduce these kids to each other. They just knew they were on the overestimator team or the underestimator team. And they gave them a series of choices. And it became very clear in the studies, in these experiments, that once these kids were on the team, it didn't really matter how arbitrary it was. They wanted to win. And they wanted to beat the other team. So much that they would actually make judgments that were harmful to them. So one of the things he said, okay, you guys can be, he said, you have you can get $20 for your team as long as the other team gets $20. Or you can get $15 for your team, but then the other team only gets 10. Simply, that's my numbers, but that was the basic idea. And universally, the kids voted for 15. They're actually punishing themselves just so they could beat the other team. They wanted to win. It didn't really matter if there was no substance to that win. And that was really sort of, I think, a lesson in sort of group dynamics in tribes, how it becomes so easy for us to identify with our team, and so much desire, how intrinsic in us to beat the other side. And I think that's a lot of the story that's going on around the world, and actually describes fundamentally some of the tribalism that's going on in America today.
Yeah, I love that story. And it shows that I read the whole book, because that was at the end of the book.
It was.
One of the stories you tell.
You started at the back, didn't you?
I did skip around. I went both ways to the middle, but I read it all. One of the stories you tell at the beginning of the book kind of sets up my next question, which is the classic line by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts, right? And you actually say, people have different views on facts all the time, and you tell the story of this Dartmouth-Princeton football game in 1951, which was particularly brutal. There were noses broken and cheap shots taken. And these social scientists take the film of this game and they show it to future years of Dartmouth and Princeton college students. And this is the case now, and it was especially the case in the 1950s, that the populations of these colleges are essentially interchangeable, right? Socioeconomically, racially, in the 1950s, probably all men's universities at the time. And the two groups, Dartmouth and Princeton students, had radically different takes on a 3.5-hour football game.
Right.
And then you point out, look, think about what we learned from this, and now consider an 18-month sprawling, media-saturated election campaign, and think about how differently a laid-off factory worker in Youngstown and a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley is going to view this. How can we say that there's only one interpretation of a single set of facts?
Yeah.
And you take that through a set of complex issues in the book: climate change, government programs when it comes to poverty, coal. I'm wondering if you can tell us a story about how your view on an issue changed as you opened yourself up to a new set of facts or a different interpretation of a known set of facts.
Yeah, so the one issue that you didn't mention there that I spent a lot of time on was guns. Obviously a hot button issue to talk about today. And I actually built the sort of the issues I was going to talk about in the book and study in the book and try to see things from the other side around issues that I knew I didn't know tons about, never studied them in depth. I was sure I was right. I mean, I come from, I don't know anyone who owns guns. None of my family, none of my close friends. That might be a slight exaggeration, but by and large, guns were something that the police and military have, and not private citizens. And I spent a good deal of time trying to see, trying to explore it from the conservative side and trying to understand John Lott's, the conservative economist's views on more guns, less crime. I went to gun shows. I went pig hunting in Texas. And there's actually a story that, which actually is in the book because it happened afterwards. And it's a terrible story. So I went pig hunting in a place called Gonzales, Texas, 2 hours west of Houston. You want to see things from the conservative side, Republican side, great. How do you do that? I mean, how do you have Republicans' experiences? It's a fairly arbitrary thing. So I went to see Tucker Carlson and said, hey, I want to be Republican for a year. What do I do? And without a pause, he said, go pig hunting in Texas. So I did. And I had never shot a gun before. I went pig hunting in Texas. And I tell the story, and some of the people I met along the way, including my hunting mentor, a 9-year-old boy named Isaac from Georgia, who sort of taught me the ropes. But the Gonzales, Texas is about 10 miles as the crow flies from Sutherland Springs, where the church shooting took place last year. I think I don't remember how many, too many people were killed by a guy with an AR-15. And in some ways, you can look at the set of facts around Sutherland Springs, and they're two completely different narratives. Each side has their own listen to. So it's a very obvious, how could this guy have an AR-15, walk into a church and shoot a lot of people? It's horrible. They shouldn't be AR-15s. But if you know there's another lens on it, which is also important to know, which is the guy who, the murderer, the killer, was eventually chased down by an NRA instructor with his own AR-15 and killed. And that's because if you're in Texas, in Gonzales, Texas, about 10 miles as a crow flies from Gonzales, about 40 miles by road because it loops around. There's not a cop within 40 miles. So it's the bumper sticker, which is rather a gun in my hand than a cop on the phone, and that's a very strong narrative, in that part of Texas. And two people can look at the same set of facts and come away with completely different takeaways. And they're both legitimate, and we could argue about that, and it's a very powerful, difficult thing to talk about. But they're both legitimate perspectives that have real ideas and real meaning behind them. But they compete with each other, and we have to recognize we can't dismiss the other side, whichever side we're on.
By the way, Marie Griffith, who is an estimable scholar of religion, should have seen the look when you said, go pig hunting in Texas.
Have you never been pig hunting in Texas? Yeah.
That might have been the source of the look.
So it may make you feel better that it turns out, not only I'd never shot before, but it turns out, against every sort of boyhood expectation, I'm a terrible shot. So no pigs were harmed in the making of this book.
However, a chapter was written in a book, which is something we all think is good. So you've been involved in the media for a long time, right? You are. It occurred to me reading about your background at NPR that there's probably no media outfit, at least on the mainstream liberal side of things, that outfits its members quite as tribally as NPR does, right? Tote bags, T-shirts, bumper stickers, right? There's a sense of you don't just listen to NPR. You are part of a virtuous community. $11 a month right here, right?
Thank you.
And yes, and you write for The Atlantic, you write for Slate, Washington Post. You're basically, this is my, when I actually have the time, this is my weekly diet of reading and listening. You also are self-reflective enough to say, look, I am sure that in the liberal bubble that was NPR, that is at The Atlantic, et cetera, the choice of story, certainly the choice of telling, emerges from this bubble. Is there a particular story that comes to mind that you've been involved in, that you supervised or that you edited over the course of the past 10 or 20 years of your career in this general world, Atlantic, NPR, Washington Post, again, my diet of information, that you think to yourself, when you were with evangelicals, when you were not harming a pig in in Texas, when you were talking to coal miners in Kentucky, you think to yourself, man, that story we did in 2007 or whatever, there was a whole different angle that I didn't see.
Yeah, I think it's I don't have a crisp answer to that about a particular story, but it has made me reflective, sort of my experience has made me reflective on the composition of the newsroom at NPR, but really in mainstream media generally, New York Times, Washington Post, Vanity Fair, where I do most of my writing now. When I wrote this book, I traveled around the country. I didn't really want to write about media, but people wanted to talk to me about media. It's one of the interesting things. They wanted to talk about how they felt locked out of the national conversation, how they felt patronized, how they felt that this was, when they were covered, it was covered not genuinely, but sort of anthropologically. And it made me give a lot of thought back to the conversations I had when I ran NPR. And so, this is really, I sort of feel bad for using NPR as an example here, because in many ways I think NPR is the best of the breed in terms of its making sure that all voices from around the country are heard. But it's the example I know best. So I mean, diversity was extraordinarily important in NPR. And it's a little bit like diversity on Hobart Street. Racial diversity, gender diversity, but not political diversity. And I remember raising this issue when I was NPR and being, and I was the CEO at the time, and there's always this sort of publisher, newsroom wall being told, look, we hear you, but these are serious journalists trying to tell stories from both sides. And it's true. But it's also true, I think, that at places like NPR and the New York Times and the and Washington Post, the newsroom is basically made of progressives. And I don't think we would never cover, without at all denigrating sort of the seriousness of purpose of those journalists and their dedication to the craft of telling stories both sides, we would never think of covering race issues with only white guys, no matter how good they were, or covering gender issues, again, with men, no matter how dedicated to the craft they are, because that inherently changes the nature of the coverage. And I think it's, I don't think the media has questioned itself enough about how can we tell political stories with newsrooms that no one knows for sure, because there's no statistics on it, but everyone knows for sure that voted vastly for Hillary Clinton and not at all for Donald Trump. And I think that's a problem of perspective that's hard to deal with. And if there's one, I think if the media wants to be in a different place, it needs to grapple with it in the future.
You want to watch me get you in trouble?
Oh, I'm already in enough trouble with people because of that.
So if this is the case for the media, is this the case for higher ed? So
No.
Bloomberg does a commencement at Harvard a couple years ago
Someone's clapping back there.
in which he says, look, 98% of your humanities faculty are Democrats. How do you call yourselves diverse?
Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt has just launched Heterodox Academy on this idea, which is basically, how do we have diversity in academic disciplines if there is a political groupthink?
Yeah.
Right? If it's the case in media, which you've been closest to, do you think that it could be the case in higher ed?
Yeah, I think I'll take the safe bet. Yes, that there's a similar challenge, maybe a different dynamic. I mean, I think the challenge, there's a consequence, and it's not a consequence you only hear one side of the story. Although I assume that one of the purposes of the university is to hear divergent views and to challenge your views. But there's a consequence to only hearing one side of the story, whether you're conservative or Republican, conservative or liberal. And if you start, I mean, if at the very beginning, where we live, where we learn, what we watch and we listen to, has that confirmation bias. That's a quote from Emma Roller, who wrote in the New York Times. We begin to make sure, we begin to believe that we're right and they're wrong. And we lose one thing that worries me most, the presumption that there's good faith on the other side. And when that happens, I think that becomes a very dangerous dynamic in American democracy. And it's interesting to me about who should deal with that. I think about the media a lot and their responsibilities. We could also talk about the university and their responsibilities equally as well.
You know, I feel like I live
Did
in.
that get me in trouble?
Potentially, we'll see. We'll see what the Q&A looks like.
Yeah.
Because look, there's a higher ed version. Well, you will note I did not offer an opinion on that. I only asked for your opinion on it. I am neutral.
Very brave. Yeah.
I am neutral. I am just seeking information. But if the way journalists talk about this, which is you can trust our worldview because of how much time we have spent seeking information in the world. There's an academic version of this. Both of these are plausible, right? You can trust our worldview because we have to accord by the rigors of a discipline. You don't get to a university unless you're really smart and really rigorous, and therefore, our judgment, our worldview is more trustworthy, right? Which is is a reasonable rejoinder to the worldview political diversity move, which is basically, look, it's the Paul Krugman statement, which is smart people are Democrats.
Right.
You know,
facts lead you.
That's exactly right.
Facts lead you to the left. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think everyone on the left thinks that, and everyone on the right thinks something dramatically different.
One of the things that I was struck by about your book was the other narratives you offered were really, in other words, the other way of interpreting the facts. Yeah. There were facts that I hadn't heard. So I knew about the first use of the AR-15 in Sutherland Springs, Texas. I am sure that there was a line or two or three in the 8 New York Times stories I read about how the shooter was stopped. Yeah. For whatever reason, didn't stick out in my mind. I mean, a very kind of a confessional moment on a different issue is the first time that the word opioid registered for me was like 2006 or 2007. Mm. And I remember it because I was deep into the Oscars So White kind of movement, you know, very frustrated that, you know, particularly, maybe this is probably not even 2000, probably this is 2012, 2013, right? Very frustrated that all these great movies of that particular year with great black writers and great black actors weren't being recognized. So I'm like reading Atlantic and New Yorker and New York Times pieces on this. And then I come across, maybe it's the Angus Deaton study of the mortality rate amongst working class whites had spiked so dramatically that economists could only compare it to AIDS in the 80s. And you look in that article and I'm like, and I read the word opioid, and I remember thinking to myself, what's an opioid?
Yeah.
And of course, 2 clicks into that rabbit hole, I'm thinking, oh, this is, for 30 years, this has been ravaging vast swaths of America that I haven't been within 20 miles of. My kids don't know what a Cracker Barrel is.
Yeah.
And that's both true and it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They don't,
Yeah.
but when we're like on a vacation or whatever, 30 miles from a city, and they walk into the local grocery store and they don't like the look of the watermelons, they will ask the clerk, where's the nearest Whole Foods? Because they have better watermelons.
Right.
Right? And it's a recognition. There's all of the, there's a great line by Susan Sontag, whatever is happening, there's always something else going on, right? Oscars So White is a legit movement, and it's not a spike in mortality rates amongst the whole segment of the population.
Yeah, I mean, it's the stories that changes your views. When I think of the sort of the, without at all diminishing it, or actually disagreeing with the arguments being made about what we need to do about gun control after after Parkland and way too many others. I also don't forget where the vast majority of shootings take place. And I didn't know most of this. I mean, it's all publicly available, but killings with homicides through long guns, not just AR-15s, constitute about 4% of gun homicides in this country. The real action, you have to be careful with diction, all those things. Shooting with handguns, mostly in cities, but even more importantly, the place where there's real dramatic increases, gun suicides. And that actually brings us back to opioids, because it's largely working class whites who have seen their sense of the future, their sense of optimism, their sense of hope disappear. Disappear into opioids, disappear into SSI, disappear into unemployment and single motherhood, fatherhood for their kids. That's actually the place where, gun policy has really failed. Because it's not really about gun policy, it's about mental health, it's about economic growth, and those are deeply complex and troubling issues.
Last couple questions, right?
Yeah.
Does seeing the other side make you a traitor?
I have been called Benedict Arnold. So I'll diverge. I mean, I think one of the disappointing things, but not surprising things, is how angry people get when they think you are a traitor, when they think you are doing what I think is actually a very sort of liberal thing to do. Which is trying to see things from different points of view and trying to understand other tribes in this country. But a lot of people who've never read the book love to call me, say if I learn to love the right, which is not necessarily to sort of have the bonds of affection and not necessarily agree with them, I also must be a racist or hate gays or be a Benedict Arnold. I mean, there is that diction going on in social media that worries me enormously. I don't know whether, I spent my life as a Democrat, but for this book, I'm going to be all in. If I'm going to try to see things from someone else's point of view, I went down to the voter registration office in Washington, D.C. and became a Republican. One of the few in Washington, D.C. A little bit of street theater, but I thought it was actually an important symbol. And when I came back, not literally but figuratively, I re-registered as an independent because I didn't love even though the subtitle of the book is I didn't love to learn the right, is I love to learn the right. I certainly didn't love to learn to love the Republican Party of Donald Trump. But I became a lot more jaundiced about American politics and both parties, and has left me thinking that neither party is serving the American public very well, or even their core constituencies very well. So I don't think that makes me a traitor, but it does make me a changed person after this experience.
Yeah. Okay, so final question. So one of the things that struck me about the book was the time you spent with evangelicals, right? With John and Azu played Virgil to your Dante in some of that territory. And as I'm reading that chapter, part of what you're walking us through your set of realizations. One is, wow, these people, I thought that they would only care about abortion and same-sex marriage issues. Turns out they care a lot about race. They care a lot about basically, these people care about the same things that I do.
They're actually people. They're not stick figures. Yeah, it was a learning along the way. Yeah.
Realization number 2 was, wow, these people do it a lot better than my people do. When we do an anti-poverty thing, a service project, a couple dozen people show up. But when this evangelical guy in Portland does it, there are hundreds of people, and they don't just come once, they come every week. Yeah. And this notion of, wow, your group exemplifies a value that my group loves to trumpet, but you guys do it better. Is that a fair reading on some of your time with the evangelicals?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is a lot of the year is a lesson in humility. How little I know and how quickly I was to assume often the worst about, or even limited things about the others. So I'll sort of step back and tell you, if you want to understand Republicans in the United States, you have to understand evangelicals. The largest religious group in the country, votes 80% Republican. Doesn't really matter who's running, whether they're of high moral character or not. I mean, that's one of the truisms of tribal politics. I'm an agnostic Jew from Washington, D.C., who wouldn't know the inside of a church, let alone an evangelical church. So John and Azu, professor at Washington University Law School, became a little bit of my guide. And first thing he did was bring me to a triennial, something called Urbana, a triennial gathering of 15,000 evangelical youths in the Edward R. Jones Dome in St. Louis, Missouri. And you talk about sort of, a middle-aged, Jewish, agnostic, I'm not going to fit in very well. And I came with sort of a lot of preconceived notions, mostly formed through what I knew about Jerry Falwell Sr., who'd been dead for a decade by that point. And I thought I would go there and talk to kids about what I thought they should be interested in. Fighting gay rights or chaining themselves in front of an abortion clinic. But they wanted to talk to me about the issues that were on their mind, and that was things that probably matter here on campus. Black Lives Matter, refugee issues, how to help them, not how to keep them out. And I was struck by sort of the social commitments of this group that was very different and very admirable, really, in ways that I didn't expect. And my hero out of this is sort of, you alluded to them passing. Some of my heroes out of this was a guy named Sam Adams, who was a little bit actually unknown but somewhat historic figure in American politics, the first openly gay mayor of a major U.S. city, in his case, Portland, Oregon. Who formed who grew up closeted in Oregon at a time when there was a lot of negative energy, for lack of a better term, around gay rights. There was ballot movements by very conservative folks, very conservative Christian communities, try to stop the teaching of gay rights in schools and ridiculous things like that. So he had every reason to be suspicious of the evangelical community. But to what you allude to is he ended up forging this extraordinary partnership with a fellow who was really the head of the local evangelical community. He needed help as the mayor of Portland, and evangelicals, it turned out, in Portland wanted to be known what they were for, not what they were against. And they were able to mobilize thousands of volunteers to help them in schools and all sorts of programs. And it was the most important partnership of Mayor Adams's work. And what he said to me is, you know, on any 10 issues, I will agree with, we'll agree on 8. There are a couple of issues we're not going to agree on, but why are we spending our time focusing on the 2 when we should be thinking about the 8? And I found that to be sort of a very different view in American politics today, which is much more about exploiting differences and the anger at them, as opposed to finding common ground, which which hopefully the book was about.
Yeah, right. Reminds me of, I'm an Obama Democrat quoting Ronald Reagan, so I'm learning from your book, but the Ronald Reagan line, that somebody who agrees with you on 80% of the issues is not a 20% traitor.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So thank you. We've got maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes for audience questions. I've enjoyed this time tremendously. And right here.
So,
why don't you introduce yourself, name and something else?
I'm Steve Neville, and I just like to come to these things. So, I've worked with people. I worked in the government for a while in the defense industry, and so it was a primarily conservative group, and I had lots of good discussions with heartfelt conservatives. I would read George Will and Mike Gerson and even Ross Dohat and Jennifer Rubin, and but now none of those names I just kicked off has a good thing to say about the president.
Yeah.
And so
right.
It seems like he personally has driven an even bigger wedge between thoughtful people of the 2 sides. And so, and as for knowing people that voted for Trump, yeah, I got in-laws. They all live in mid-Missouri, and the big sort, from my perspective, is urban and rural, with the suburbs being the the battlegrounds. I don't even know how to talk to these folks anymore, because it's like, if I am a Democrat, I'm an evil creature. And
yeah. So it's interesting. I had plenty of time during the course of researching and writing this book, which I started before Trump came along, at a time when I was concerned about polarization, which seems quaint in reflection. And I had plenty of time to wonder whether I was just dead wrong about this, right? That, that my belief in listening to others and finding common ground was something that didn't make sense in a country that would vote for Donald Trump. But I spent a lot of time. Most of my mentors along the way are sort of never Trumpers. Pete Wehner and Michael Gerson and plenty of others who taught me about conservative policies, but weren't interested in supporting Donald Trump because God knows what he is. But I spent time. But I didn't spend just time in, at the American Enterprise Institute and places like that. I spent time in Youngstown, Ohio, and I spent time in Pikeville, Kentucky, and Pig Hunting, Texas. And I talked to a lot of people who I grew to respect, who support, who I think whose votes were coming from a place, I don't think necessarily about policy, but sort of a place about anger and despair. I mean, I think Trump is really a story of anger, a man who's capable of exploiting that anger and despair of tens of millions of Americans. I met a lot of people who said, this is back to the story of, declining life expectancy, declining income, declining belief in the sort of the American dream in the future. And I met a lot of folks who said, felt betrayed by the establishment of both parties, and would say things like, so many people said to me, like, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, or maybe Bernie Sanders. And that sort of puzzled me, because on the policy perspective, what the hell are you thinking? But on the sense that, nothing has worked in the ordinary sense. We need something different. And I heard that expressed in lots of different ways, which is, maybe Trump will be a great president, or maybe he'll cause World War III. And that was a bet that a lot of people seemed to be willing to make. It wasn't a good bet for me, because things actually are pretty good on Hobart Street. But they're not so good looking up from the bottom of the pile in Pikeville, Kentucky. So I thought of a lot of the folks who voted for him not as sort of a carefully thought out policy perspective, because you drive yourself nuts trying to figure out that equation, but really of a sense that America has disserved them in some ways, and that something needed to be different, whatever that was. And they were voting for the most different person. I think from that perspective, didn't agree with it by any stretch of the imagination, but at least began to understand the perspective of a lot of people who voted for Trump.
Thank you for that question. Here.
My name is Harvey Schneider, and I'm past president of the Interfaith Partnership here in St. Louis. You spent a lot of time very informatively on the politics aspect. My question is, what impact or effect has religion had on the tribalism that you described previously?
So, obviously religion drives a lot of core beliefs. So you meet a lot of sort of single issue voters or two issue voters that are built around religion, whether that's abortion or something, or gay rights or things like that. So it drives a lot of, I think, a lot of core political beliefs. But I think it's, I think it's the thing that interests me most is actually the decline in religion in terms of its importance of, in terms of tribe. I don't think this is going to be a good answer to your question, but it interests me, so I'll just sort of riff on it anyway, so forgive me for that. I think one of the reasons that politics is so important in identity now is because other things have become less important. So labor unions have become less important in their identity. Religion has become, with the rise of the nuns and other things like that, where fewer and fewer people identify with a religious group, becomes less important in terms of how you identify yourself. And that has created, with us being so tribal by, I think, by some odd form of DNA, it means that politics has sort of replaced religion, has replaced, in some ways, economic class as how we think of ourselves. At some point in my life, I would have thought it was, it's good that we're not dividing ourselves as much along religious grounds. It's less of an identifier. Now I think it's dangerous that we found the substitutes that have pushed religion aside and pushed political antagonism to the forefront. It reminds me a little bit, by the way, do you remember do any of you all know the old, and this is really a diversion, do you remember the old Tom Lehrer song, National Brotherhood Week? Does anyone know that song? All right, so there's at least one. I love talking about Tom Lehrer. So he was a Harvard, I think, mathematician or physicist who kind of he didn't give it up, but became famous for writing a song, sort of political songs that were very catchy. And my parents had they had records when I was a boy. And one of them was called National Brotherhood Week, which was actually something that was real, set up by, I think, the National Catholic Conference in the 20s and 30s. And the song went, all the white folks hate the black folks hate the white folks, and it sort of kept going. It's like the Protestants hate the Catholics hate the Protestants, the Muslims hate the Hindus, and everybody hates the Jews. But during National Brotherhood Week, we get along. And I mean, it was a really, a sort of a piercing criticism of how we divide ourselves. And as I listen to those lyrics again, read those lyrics, all those divisions are still here, but I think subsumed under politics. So he never said, and the Democrats hate the Republicans, and the Republicans hate the Democrats, because he wouldn't have thought about that. It wasn't that division. But now that is the tribe that sort of overarches everything else. And it's just a very different world than when Lara was writing these songs in 1960 and 61.
Here, and then here, and then here.
My name is Dana Logan, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Religion and Politics. So I want to defend academics. Most academics choose to live their entire lives in non-cosmopolitan places, which strikes me as an incredible dedication to engaging in conversations with people who are from, in most cases, non-liberal backgrounds. I'm curious for you what the bar is for engaging in conversations that are about understanding, and what constitutes that kind of dedication to inhabiting the space of another person.
Yeah, you got to go out and write a book, spend a year writing a book. I mean, there's just no other substitute for that. You know, it's interesting. I'm not going to disagree with you. You know more about the university setting than I am, and I'm going to be, one of the things I've learned along the way is to say, you know, I don't really know. But I will say that people are able to create micro communities. And I'm not saying that academics do this, but if you go to places like Milwaukee, which is the second most politically segregated cities in the country, how people have actually sorted themselves out into red counties and blue counties. You can actually drive across a line. There's a line between, in this case, Milwaukee City and Wausau, I'll get this wrong, county. And you go from blue land to red land. And it's from 80% Democratic to 80% Republican. As a whole community, it's actually fairly balanced. But they've sorted themselves out in ways that people don't need, even if they're there in the same community, they don't actually have to interact with each other. And I wonder whether some of that is true with academics in their community as well. I don't know, but I would sort of raise that. And I think, you know, the people that have really interested me, who I grew to admire, are more authentic than I am in searching out others. I did it as part of the book project, but who's in their everyday lives, search out others in search of dialogue. I admire Eboo's work around faith communities, because I think that's also around political communities. That's their, you know, those are the people I think who every day are trying to create those lines of dialogue. One of the interesting things is you actually see it, I saw it in my book, Book Travels, but you also see it in the social science experiments. It actually doesn't take much if you get people together talking to change people's points of view about the other side. Actually very pliable people in real life. We're terribly insensitive and sure of our rightness in social media. And when we're listening to Fox, if that agrees with us, or MSNBC with agrees, easy to reconfirm your views. When you get face to face with someone who thinks differently, it's relatively, you see sort of how people views change. So I really admire the people who are, and I think of it as sort of an obligation of the university community to bring who are working to bring together people across political or religious or social lines, because that's the only way we're going to actually sort of restore this notion of good faith and this idea of what you might call the American super community.
I wonder if there's something behind this question. Part of this is I'm probably on 20 or 25 campuses a year, and not that many of them are Washington University. It's more like McMurray College in Amarillo, Texas, right? And probably a dozen other places like that. And I have had no small number of conversations with like a gay faculty member at McMurray who's like, so you're the one person every 3 months I can tell that I'm gay because I can't tell anybody in my college I'm gay, right? And I wonder if the point you're making is, if you're me and you fly into Amarillo for 36 hours and you're going back to Berteau Avenue, I collect lots of nice stories about people in Amarillo and McMurray that I bring back to my cosmopolitan friends. But my man there, it's like, you know, this is a wonderful community, and I get fired. They knew I was gay.
Yeah.
Or some version of that. And I wonder if part of what you're saying is it's true about the vast majority of colleges in this country. They're in places like Oberlin, Ohio, Kenyon, Ohio, Amarillo, Texas, in which, depending on your identity, inhospitable is a mild term.
Yeah, but I think that's it's not a function. I mean, it's a powerful story, but I think that's true not just for universities. We're more and more in places, because how we sort ourselves out, that's inhospitable to the other side. 15 years ago, there were about 1,000 what are called landslide counties, counties that one party or another won by more than 20%. This time around, there are 2,500. The overall vote didn't change that much, still pretty close, but how it was distributed, because people have sorted themselves out into a way that they're living with people who they agree with. And I suspect that's in work, in school, and otherwise. A fellow came to see me the other day, walked into my office and hand-delivered me a letter. He lives in Washington, D.C. He works in the legal community. He's a Trump supporter. And he's afraid to admit that to anyone he knows. And he says, in the letter, he says he drives out into Virginia, into red country, to find social circles that he can sort of be himself, much like your professor from McMurray. And I think it is an awful thing that your professor at McMurray has to hide his views. I think the same for this fellow in Washington, D.C.
You know, I'll just say one more thing on this one. So, and this is, I think, where my progressive stripes start to show, right? Because I love the book, and I want to sympathize with that guy.
Yeah.
And I just don't think it's the same thing as being gay at a college where you can't be gay. Right? To be a free market conservative and to not be able to talk about that openly and to be like, I can't have a partner here. I think my sense is those are different.
Yeah, I don't know if it's competition between the two. I think I would say both are stories that are wrong, right? You can rank them and argue about that and probably just agree with you. But it's a problem, I think, when we're in a place where if you come out and say what your political beliefs are, you're going to be essentially tarred and feathered. You're going to be ostracized by your community. That wasn't true when Tom Lehrer wrote National Brotherhood Week, but it's true now.
Do you bring your spouse to your kids' play, right? And in other places you can't. I mean, you know, so we don't have to, right? But I think to myself, the principal of my kid's school has never shown up to any school event with a partner that I am pretty sure that he has. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. And that is a sadness to me.
It is a sadness.
So this is kind of going back to a little bit of what you've talked about with different answers to questions, but so for better and worse, I am one of those people who has a lot of people on the Trump side and a lot of people on the Hillary side. And as I'm listening to you talk a lot, something that I've encountered a lot is what you do with those one or two issue voters. right? The people who do focus on the 20%. And how do you start moving them and helping them to think more about the 80% that they have in common? Because, to some extent, that is kind of like the key that we're all looking for here, right?
Yeah.
Because it is really hard when you have two people who can say exact same, so I'm originally from the Deep South and had right side by side one person, you cannot be, a good Christian and vote for Trump. And if you are a good Christian, you must vote for Trump, right? So how do you think as, kind of more centrist-ish people, we help people think more about the 80%?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I had a optimistic answer because, my sense of America today is most of the forces are focused on pointing at the points of disagreement. That's media, that's politics, it's the world division. It's interesting, and to me, how many people actually want to find common ground? You don't hear about them. I think the interesting thing is you don't really hear about them in media. You don't see them in social media. But one of the things I've observed is how tired people are of the cacophony that we live in. And one of the things I've noticed and written about is how many people are leaving the political parties. Not because they're changing their point of view, but because they're embarrassed by the diction of both of the parties. The biggest political trend over the last generation, I would argue, is the growth of independents, which now are 40 to 45 to 46% of the American public. And I think that's because there are people out there who, they're not necessarily changing their views, they're not necessarily even moderates, but they don't like this politics of division. And someday, if I have a political perspective, it's to give voice to those folks who I think more about comedy than they are about comedy with a T, not a D. More about comedy than they are about necessarily winning every argument.
Excellent question. Thank you. So here.
Thank you. I'm James Croft. I'm the Outreach Director of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, which is a humanist congregation here in the city. So when you were speaking about a lack of political diversity on campuses and in the media, your argument relied on an analogy between political identity and racial, ethnic, sexual, and gender identity. And you said things like, if we spoke about race with only white people, it would be a problem. And when we speak about politics with only progressive people, it's a problem. And this gets to something that Eboo was talking about a second ago. It seems to me that that analogy is a very bad one, that in principle, political identity is quite different to those other forms of identity. Firstly, we don't choose our racial or ethnic or sexual identity. Secondly, they're not responsive to evidence or reasons, where political identity should, in principle, be responsive to evidence and reasons. And thirdly, there are often structural and institutional impediments to being black or gay or transgender, when there are very rarely structural and institutional impediments to being conservative. There may be some social consequences to being conservative, but you'll very rarely be fired from a job or be given a harsher prison sentence if you are a conservative, when that will happen in many parts of the country if you're gay or transgender or black. So it seems to me that that analogy, which is fundamental to some of your argument, is very bad, and I'd like you to convince me otherwise.
Okay, I will do my best. So I think the point, it's interesting when you talk about politics, which is, I will argue that one of the things I've learned in talking about politics, one is it inevitably gets everyone mad, and people hear things that you're not saying, or at least you don't intend to say. And the consequences, one of the consequences of that is makes people reluctant to talk about politics with anyone who disagrees with them. I think the point I was making actually was not a direct comparison between race and or gender identification and political identification. I was talking about the responsibility of the media. to tell a well-rounded story about politics in America and a well-rounded story about political issues. And very hard to do that when you walk into assumption about which side is right and which side is wrong, about what's important, about what voices should be heard, you know, what is the right take on it? Which is actually, if you come back to sort of the Sutherland Springs story, Eboo didn't know that it was the citizen who used his own AR-15 for good cause in the end. An important part of the story. And that's because I think that's not the narrative that liberals want to take. And that's the challenge, which is how do you tell a well-rounded story when you have preconceived notions about who's important and who's right? And I think the only way to deal with that is to have a diversity of views within the newsroom. And that's really about, I mean, in a time when, and part of this is actually sort of my concern about the media. You know, trust in institutions are way down, and part of part of where you see the decline in trust is with the media. Last year, 2016, only 32% of people said they trusted the media. 48% of people, including a lot of Democrats, said they thought the media made it fake news. It's actually the power of Trump's phrasing that immediately worms its way into it. That worries me enormously. This is a pillar, media is a pillar of democracy, faith in media, faith in sort of common set of facts or common values, really important in the direct function of media, of democracy. And when media is mistrusted as being from one side and not the other, that's a problem. And sort of my concern is, how do you try to fix that? And that's by trying to get different perspectives into the newsroom, or otherwise people are just going to write it off as saying, well, that's just the narrative of the other side. Thank God I got Fox News to tell me the truth, which is the way it's playing out right now.
Great. Okay, we've got hands. I'm going to go over here first, and then I'm going to come back here and here and here. Yes.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Brooke. I was an atheist that majored in religious studies. And so my question related to what you just said is there a similar kind of like navel-gazing conversation among conservative media that's going on? Because I feel like what you've been talking about is, you know, empathy for arguments on the other side, and that certainly seems to be a conversation that a lot of liberals have been having, mostly I think because they are interested in winning elections. But do you think that this conversation is necessary among similar conservative spaces, whatever the analog of liberal universities is? And do you think that that conversation is necessary to restore a good faith argumentation in American politics? And if so, is there evidence that that's happening? Or if not, how do we get there?
Yeah, I think everyone needs to have more navel-gazing conversations in the future. I'm firmly in favor of navel-gazing conversations. Yeah, so it's actually a really good question. So some people have said to me, somewhat as a challenge, well, that's great that you as a liberal have gone out and tried to see things from the other side. Good for you. Where's the conservative doing that? I don't think that I can only do it from my side. I'd love to see it from the other side. I don't see a lot of energy to try to see things from the liberal side, unfortunately. And I would love to see someone write Democrat like me, or I just don't know who's going to do that. Because I think we need, everything I would say about liberals is at least equally true on the other side. Everyone thinks they have a monopoly on fairness and tolerance, and no one does. You know, it was great to go out and listen to conservatives and learn from them. They sure as hell should be doing the same. And I don't see a lot of people doing that. Even among the people I grew to really admire and like, who I thought were smart and thoughtful, like Pete Wehner and Arthur Brooks and others like that, really admire them, but I think there needs to be equal attempt on both sides, because it's a two-way street, or it sort of becomes pointless.
Yes.
I'm William Gruen, and in the 1950s, my father and older brother were communists. I'm now the Third Ward Republican committeeman, so I've heard things from many sides. And I think looking at division, tribalism, is not helpful. And a little preface, at Partners for Torah last week, Rabbi Roberts was talking about why it's a holy day for a Jew to be drunk, and it's because the real self comes out. And he observed, interestingly, that the more authentic and interior a person lives, the more he finds in common with people. The more a person has social masks and lives on the surface, the more narrow his associations become. So it's a matter of how we understand humanness. And it's just sin to denigrate another person. So these are just values of humanness that don't seem to carry in a lot of religious circles itself. And a second observation is it seems like the Wall Street Journal always upholds Western civilization as superior. And this seems to be, in the world, a very unhelpful paradigm. We're heading into war with China with that kind of attitude, thinking they're malicious toward us. And there's a lot of projection of motives. So the question is, well, I've talked to not many, but students in philosophy from India and China, and I've asked them, have any of their professors asked them what their native philosophies are? And the answer is, what I've heard is no. So there's this bubble of philosophy in the West that's harmful, I think.
That's a perfectly lively standalone comment. You're welcome to comment on it also, but I didn't hear a question, so we can let that stand alone as a comment, or you can.
Yeah, so I'll say something. It seems
It's what we do for a living, right?
It seems ungracious not to say something. In terms of, I think, an interesting set of comments. I would say there's something unique. I mean, as much as we have, I want to say something nice about America. And sometimes it feels hard to do that. But there is something, I think, still unique about the fact we are still open in ways that very few other countries are to different points of view and different perspective. I mean, you can't. It's hard to be French without being French. It's still possible to be American, to be of different backgrounds and diverse viewpoints, and that doesn't work. Ultimately, and we've had lots of fights among ourselves, and we'll continue to have lots of fights among ourselves. But that idea doesn't work unless you buy into that notion that there is something special about an open society. And I think the biggest, Trump is not unique in trying to close the doors. I mean, it's happened a lot of time in American history, and that seems to me, fairly un-American to try to close ideas, because there's something special, and I don't know if it's from Western civilization or just the American experience. You don't become of allowing different points of view, allowing different perspectives and different backgrounds, and I think we need to encourage that if that's our humanness, that's our special sauce. And I worry that we're losing that in this day and age.
I'm going to do a couple more questions. So this is, all right, the couple just tripled. We're going to go to this friend back here, all the way in the back with the hat.
Hello, and welcome to St. Louis. My name is Iris Fletcher Preston, and I have a question for both of you. From my observation, at least within the past 20 years, the political discourse in this country has been or has appeared to have been somewhat uncivilized when individuals with opposing political viewpoints are discussing whatever the issues are. I made this observation a few years ago, actually on Fox and CNN. I am politically independent, and I always have been. So I look at both sides of an issue, and what I've noticed and what I have observed in the mass media is that many talk show hosts tend to undermine or hinder the First Amendment and freedom of speech when they're talking to someone with opposing view. And I've noticed this even on talk radio on the, not only here in St. Louis, but all over the country. But it definitely occurs on television. So what is your take on individuals hindering freedom of speech and others' First Amendment right who have opposing views?
So here's the observation I have about the news media. So not very long ago, the accurate narrative around the news media was that it was failing. Newspapers were going out of business. Internet startups in the news space were failing. It was a terrible business to be in. I think what the news media has learned in the Trump era that Fox News figured out long ago, which is that anger sells. Trump has actually saved the news media because people have figured out that taking one side of the story, I think to your experience, and really driving it hard really drives audience. The New York Times now just announced that it's gone over $1 billion a year in subscriptions. And I would bet heavily that is drawn by people, people who are being drawn by their coverage of the Trump administration, their unfavorable coverage of the Trump administration. The news media may have its challenges, but they're not stupid. And they learn what sells and what doesn't sell. And I think they've learned the story in sort of your observation, which is taking one side implicitly works as a business perspective. And that's why on CNN, I talked with Frank Sesno last night, the former CNN correspondent, now the dean of the public media school at George Washington, who remembers when CNN actually did reporting. CNN doesn't do reporting anymore. It does often really interesting opinion, but it's definitely opinion. And they've found that opinion works, and by implicitly that means opinion from one side, and not, and that, I mean, things excluding or belittling or driving out the opinion from the other side, which is, I think, probably what you've experienced, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna do all these questions, and I'm gonna ask you to be disciplined and make them like 2 sentences each.
Do I have to be disciplined in my answer?
Yes.
Oh, okay, that's hard. That's much harder.
Here and then here.
Hi, my name is Russ Thompson, and I'll try to make this concise. You did say a lot of very interesting things. You mentioned Kenyon. I graduated a lesbian daughter from Kenyon 2 years ago, so I asked her to come tonight. She didn't make it. I would love to have heard her opinion of being gay in Kenyon. I own an AR-15. I have a 30-round clip. Voted for Trump. I consider myself socially very liberal, fiscally very conservative. I said I'd keep this concise. Toured Washington, D.C. University, not GW.
Georgetown?
Georgetown.
Yeah.
And a young lady leading us around was talking about the wide variety of speakers they have. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, some other prominent Democrats. And I asked her, do you have a wide variety of other opinion people as speakers as well? So that addresses the academia situation that I think is fairly liberal these days. And I'd like your opinion on that. And then one other thing is I heard Ted Koppel, he wrote a book recently, and he was talking to Hannity, which I don't watch much, but he said that there used to be a law or a rule that said if you were conducting editorial news, you had to say it was editorial. That law went away, and that's how we got the plethora of basically kind of left and kind of right opinionated cable news that we have these days.
Yeah.
And you mentioned CNN. I work in Ferguson. Don Lemon asked me a question one night when a big protest was starting. He said, "Would you mind saying a word?" I'm like, "No, not at all." They brought over the camera, turned it on. He said, "Hey, all these people are taking off protesting here." He goes, "And you think that's wrong, don't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we're wrong, no." So I gave him my 2 cents worth about how it's their right to do that. That did not make the news.
So I'll try to be brief and mention, I think one of the things you're referring to is probably, I think, is something called the Fairness Doctrine, which applied to all FCC licensed television and radio stations for many years. Not cable, because cable's not licensed by the FCC, but that was a rule essentially of equal time. You have to, if you provide one set of perspectives, you had to, as a matter of public service, you had to provide the other side as well. That went away a number of years ago on the belief that there were so many voices out there, you didn't need that. No one station had that public service obligation. And you could debate the impact of it, but that was a change that probably Ted was referring to. And I think it's, I think that is, whether that sort of regulatory change was right or not, it has, I think, had a social change inside the media where people don't feel as much responsibility in the past of saying, we really have to provide all sides. And I will say, I am from time to time critical of the media. So in all fairness, to be equal time, I know many journalists doing amazing work, and some of the work, the coverage of the Trump administration is actually critical to our understanding of what's going on in the world. I think it's hard to have a nuanced conversation about these things, so I just want to sort of give equal time to, it's complicated, we really need to be introspective in the media, but also recognize the important work that a lot of journalists, whether you include Don Lemon in that or not, do every day.
Excellent. Thank you. 2 sentences.
Oh, this one, there are 2 right here.
2 sentences each.
Okay, so you had a lot of experiences that made you come up with a new mindset. And I'm a senior here, and I think that as college students, it's really uncommon to have those experiences because we're here in the classroom. So what do you think the role of the university should be in enforcing and encouraging students to get outside the classroom and hear these stories that change their mindsets as well?
I think it's a great question. Hard for me to speak to universities and their responsibilities, but the last question is, I can't imagine that a university doesn't have the responsibility to bring in competing points of view into the university and exposing their students to different points of view, or helping them get out in the community and meet people of divergent backgrounds, divergent ideas. It seems like that's I had to wait till I was 52 to have some of those experiences. I hope not others don't have to wait.
Paul Schultz, I like coming to these things too. How does one draw the line between having the reasonable position of there's people of good faith on the other side and not become, I think, the repugnant position of there's good people on both sides that our president took, for instance, in Charlottesville?
Yeah, so a really interesting question, and maybe not exactly what you're asking, but sort of like, you want to be respectful of other points of views and learn from other points of views, and you want to reject repugnant points of views. And where do you draw the line really hard? And for me, I drew the line at the gun show where around the guy who was selling Nazi paraphernalia. It was a pretty obvious line, but others have chosen to draw it in ways that I think are much more problematic around, people's views on. We talked about this in class today on religious issues, religious tests, kicking evangelical groups like InterVarsity off of campus because they have prohibitions against let's call it sexual congress, I like using that word, that phrase, outside of the bonds of marriage, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. There is, I think, a new norm where I think we are drawing the lines very tight about what is appropriate discourse and what is a legitimate point of view. As much as I want to never talk to a Nazi and have been trolled online by them, I think in a country, a pluralistic country, where we're closing the doors, points to the other side, we have to be really careful about excluding anyone from the conversation. So I sort of, for myself, I chose to draw the line at something that sort of obvious, but I would be reluctant to reject conversations with almost virtually anyone else.
Great. We're going to do two, we're going to do 1.5 sentences each, bang, bang, and then you're going to answer the easier of the two questions. That's a joke. You can here and then here, we'll take them together, 1.5 sentences each.
If someone could ask, why did you write such a great book, I will definitely answer that question.
Right there, that gentleman in the purple tie.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jack Gillis. You talked a little bit about the trends in society. Giving one narrow example, you can actually measure these things. And if you look at the degree of partisanship in the U.S. Congress, it's reached the level that we hadn't experienced since the time of the Civil War.
Right.
And yet you also cited that a lot of this stuff is just innate. It's part of our personality. You cited one study with the children where they were divided into random teams. And so some of this is just in us. There's this tribalism that you described. If both those things are true, first, why? Why are we on this trend line if it's always sort of been in us? And if we understand that, how do we reverse it?
Excellent. We'll take the second one.
That's a hard question. I think
I'm hoping
right
for
an
back
easier
there,
one.
all the way in the back, all the way in the back.
I'll take that question in the cocktail party afterwards.
Yeah.
So my question is about, before you talked about facts and how they can be seen different ways, but I guess how do you have productive conversations when the facts seem indisputable or scientific facts, such as in cases like evolution? How do you still have a productive conversation when you just can't wrap your head around the other side, I guess?
Yeah, God, those are hard questions. I mean, this is an area of hard questions. I think it's one of the things about it, and I approach this with humility. I mean, so it's interesting you mention evolution because so many Americans believe in creationism. And one of the things I did, one of the experiences I had for writing the book is I went to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, northern Kentucky, and spent a day making fun of creationists. But 40% of Americans still believe, and it's always been the case. And no matter, people tie in sort of belief in creationism with lack of education. But as the country's gotten more educated, hasn't changed the number of people who believe in creationism at all. And I think at some point, I think it's really hard because it's so such a difficult one for me to deal with on sort of a personal level. At some point, you got to say belief systems do not agree. We got to agree to disagree and try to be respectful of others along the way. And it's really hard. I mean, it was one of the hardest chapters for me to write because I could not put my hands around people of such opposing points of view. But if we want to live in a community, if we don't want to divide into sort of Redlandia and Bluelandia and have split countries, we're going to have to find ways to say, listen, I can live, believing in creation doesn't define someone. The people who believe in creation are whole peoples who have lots of different points of view, who live in communities and contribute to their communities, and have lots of different things to either recommend them. It doesn't make them un-American. It doesn't make them people who aren't contributing to their communities. I met a lot of people along the way who I didn't agree with, but admired them for the things they were doing in their communities. And I think we need to say, we don't have to agree on everything. We don't have to, but we have to honor our disagreements and recognize and look for places where we find common ground. So of the people who believe in creationism, I bet I can find almost something to like about almost all of them. Places where we agree and can respectfully disagree on the fact that the God did not literally create Earth in 6 days, and that the history of biological evolution built over 200 years of testing and retesting the scientific method is something that I value and admire. But it doesn't have to say that we can't be part of the same community. It's my best shot at that one. Sorry, I went more than a sentence half.
No problem. So thank you for your time with us on stage. I want to say that your book addresses all of these. The thing that I love, one of the things I love about your book, in addition to the excellent writing and the prolific cuss words, is that it doesn't shy away from these really hard issues, right? Like you find the things that are in effect hardest about the other side, and you go investigate those. And you ask yourself hard questions in the course of this book. So I would highly recommend the book, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you for that. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And thank you all for coming.
And that book and Eboo's book will both be available for purchase right outside during our dessert reception and for a signing. And Ken mentioned good journalists doing important work. A reminder that our next discussion in this series is with Emma Green of The Atlantic on April 3rd, right here. Thanks and good night.